What is Classical Liberalism by Alex Kaiser, a confidant of Javier Milei.
Well, thank you very much to everyone for coming to this closing talk. And to the 150 million people who are watching us live and live from all over the planet. Everyone is very interested in classical liberalism. Let's see, this is a topic that is obviously very important in what has been the trajectory of my career, but also in what has been the development of culture and Western civilization. The world would not be what it is today if it were not for the classical liberal ideas that have different roots. I am going to make an introduction. This is not something tremendously deep. You can read tons of manuals and books on this topic. So I do not intend to say that with this there is nothing more to learn. No, not at all. In fact, this is a varnish compared to each of the topics that we are going to touch. And we are going to try to do something a little more dynamic. Because at this time you are already so tired, your brain does not retain you. You are thinking about taking the surprise at the exit. Do you have a surprise, Eugenio? Well, it's fine. So, well, classical liberalism. What is classical liberalism? Is it an ideology? Is it a philosophy? What is it? Is it a theory? It's just a question that does not have an easy answer. What we know, right? I am here using important figures of the history of liberal thought, so that you can realize that they are talking about this doctrine. Of this stream of ideas. And what do they say? They are their speakers, so to speak. And I have brought fundamental messages for you. First, one who aims to maximize individual freedom can be called a liberal. If you are liberals in the classical sense, which is, in my opinion, the only one that really counts, because the other is a bastardization of the concepts of liberalism that comes later, you are going to seek to restrict the coercion of the state in the lives of individuals as much as possible, okay? And at the same time, create a social ecosystem that favors the free development of the life projects of all of us. For example, one could have a society in which the law says that men and women are the same, but the cultural practices of that society make women have a situation of complete subordination to men. And not necessarily because it says that there is equality before the law. You have equality of options and personal development. This is seen in Europe. That is, the Islamic communities that live in Europe, in France, in Germany. Although in theory there is a constitution, equality before everything, in those Islamic communities that law does not apply, the culture is different. And therefore, it is not true, women are in a complete subordinate situation. In fact, there are thousands of cases every year of forced marriage, where women of minor age are hunted under the threat of death, even in many cases with older relatives who come from Anatolia or from elsewhere. There are dozens of thousands of cases every year of female genital mutilation in Europe, which is supposed to be illegal, but it happens. That is not liberal, okay? I suppose that in that they agree, both the liberals more from the centre-left and the classic liberals. So, as Oakton said, which is one of the great references of this current idea, the polar north of everything liberal is this, right? The idea of freedom as a value in itself. It is not a means to achieve something else, no. It is a pin in itself. That is what we have to be clear about, right? And then you are going to tell me, well, but what is freedom? What is freedom? What can you tell me? What is freedom? That is the one in my law. That is the one in my law, based on Alberto Benegas Lynch, right? I do not have to pretend that you are better educated than me, you are not here. They are all answering the question in a very pertinent way. Indeed, those things mean that they are in a free society. When there is absence of coaxial arbitrariness, which is the same, finally, that respects the life project of others. and the one who best raised it is the founding father of classic political modern, which is John Locke. And this is very important because in today's discussion there is too much confusion around what liberalism means. You see liberal, and Andrés Velasco says that he is liberal, and you see people like that who say they're liberal. And of course they have ingredients of a classic liberal tradition, but they are not strictly liberal in the classical sense, because they believe in the state as an agent who designs social progress and is in charge of distributing freedom, basically. We are going to see it now. But freedom basically consists, as you said, in disposing and ordering, as it seems to you, its person, actions, possessions, and all its property within the framework of the law, and not being subject to arbitrary will, which is what you raised. This is John Locke, the second essay on the civil government. It is a text that I have read many times, because despite its brevity, it is rich and impressive, and one always finds new things to think about these subjects. But notice that John Locke speaks of the law. Why does he speak of the law? Because there is no freedom, and the order can be represented within it. That's right, that's right. This is very important to have at present. Freedom, I have said it before, but it is something that liberals completely forget. It is a type of order. It is not to do whatever you want. No, freedom implies by definition limits. So when you are told that you are a neoliberal, or a liberal who wants everyone to do whatever they want, no, it is not like that. In fact, freedom is a type of social order that is governed according to rules, obviously moral, social, and ethical. Moral, social, and legal, that delimit the possibility of action of all of us, of each one of us. I explain myself. I mean, of course, I can have my own property. John Locke says, you have your own property, but not the property of others. Therefore, if I intend to take the property of others, I am not acting according to the rules of freedom. That is not freedom. That, in fact, is destroying freedom. The destruction of freedom. Or if I do not let you express yourself, as Sergio Mico was done with the fascists at the University of Chile. Well, what is that? That is not a liberal order, a liberal social order. That is a practice of totalitarian censorship. That is asking him to pursue his life project, or basically exercise a fundamental right. So that is outside the framework of liberalism. Freedom is understood as a political concept. What does that mean? I have said it several times, but I am going to insist on it again, because, as Milton Friedman said, you have to repeat and repeat and repeat, as my Lord does with the concept that millions of people repeat it by heart. It's spectacular. Why is it a political concept? This is the key point, because it only makes sense to talk about freedom in the context of a political community, or a community, which is the same as saying political community. I am talking about the sense of polis, of the Greeks. From there comes this idea of politics, of city, society, community, whatever you want to call it. It makes no sense to talk about freedom if it is not in the context of interaction with third parties. If I go to live in La Cordillera de los Andes, and I get lost, I live alone there. What problem of freedom can I have? None. I don't have a problem of freedom, but another person who is abusing my rights. I can't have it by definition, because another person, if the lion is going to eat me, the puma is going to throw himself on me. It's not a problem of freedom either, right? Because I, as a puma, don't expect an action according to certain rules that imply agency, that is, the capacity of you to decide what you are going to do, if you respect or not the rights of a third party. And the puma cannot also adapt to the rules that are established by the state and the social conventions, obviously. That's what makes us different from animals. Although there are some people who can't either. Well, so it's a political concept. Robinson Crusoe, I always say this. And it's important, Robinson Crusoe. Does he have a problem of freedom on the island? Only? No. No. He doesn't. He has the capacity. But he has another problem, which is economic. Where do I get my food from? So I don't starve. That's an economic problem. And that economic problem you have, both in a political community, that is living with others, as not in a political community, being totally alone, isolated in the world, for the simple reason that our subsistence machinery, which is the body, the brain, all that needs calories every day to subsist. And you need more cheese, you need to come home, then medicine, etc. You need resources. That problem you always have. And here comes the great confusion of the materialists of the left, because they say that if you don't have goods and material resources, you don't have freedom. If you're poor, you don't have freedom. That's what they propose. The left, that is, liberal and egalitarian. I'm not even talking about the Marxist left, because for Marx the concept of freedom also had to do with not being subject to the chains of material needs, right? Marx understood the concept of freedom as an absence of the tyranny of all kinds of needs and biological, social mandates, even the laws of physics, in a sense that you could fly like Superman. But that's the concept. But if what I say is true, following John Locke, that you don't have a freedom problem, if Robinson Crusoe is isolated in this place where you killed a frog, then it can't be true that freedom implies having economic resources, because no one could say that because Robinson Crusoe has nothing to eat, or Tom Hanks, on the first days of the dragonfly, he has no freedom. The problem that any animal has is to eat. Any creature has that problem. But we don't talk about the lack of freedom of the hyenas when they can't hunt, no. We don't talk about the lack of freedom of the lions when they're dying. I've seen those programs on Animal Planet, or some of those, which many times are on the verge of dying because they can't hunt. It's hard, life is hard, for nature. It's not that idealization that Greta Thunberg does. No, it's not that. And that many extinctionists are following nowadays, because you know that there's a new derivative of mine today, which is the extinctionists. They're saying that half of the human race is dying except for them, so that the planet doesn't. I always say that they could start by giving an example, because they're giving this conference. So it's a political concept. It's not a mechanical concept. If I walk and I can't cross, I don't have freedom. No, it's the idea of Thomas Hobbes, of freedom, and that's where confusion can come from. In classical liberal tradition, it's a political concept, and it has to do with the limits of action in relation to my course of action. What are the limits of third-party action in the context in which I interact with others and we coexist? Okay? And that's why it's an order. And what does every order require? Rules. And for your application, what does it require? Authority. And this is something that liberals, especially nowadays, forget deeply or permanently, which is that without authority there's no freedom, because what you have is the case. Because if there's no authority, it works. If there's no government taking advantage of the fact that you're watching this live, so you understand. If there's no government, because there's no authority, the authority is government. If the authority governs, what does the authority do? Well, it implies the rules. It means that the rules are fulfilled. There's no freedom. And that's what happens in the Ukraine. You have a terrorist group where the rules are not fulfilled by the state. We'll see that in a little while. And there's no freedom, actually. Or at least, it's very restricted. So, this concept demands an abstention, that you don't interfere in the lives of others. That's basically it. What doesn't mean to consider that the lives of others are as dignified and admirable as all the others. That's another confusion. In a liberal world that's infecting progressivism, one thing is to say, I don't interfere in your lives. If you want to drive and drink cola and play PlayStation all day, it's your thing. I'm not going to force you to do another question or take another course of action. But it's very different. You can't issue any judgment about the way of life of others because it's their autonomy and their decision that's leading them to that kind of life. I'll explain. That's like saying, no, everyone is going to dedicate themselves to be drug addicts. I don't have anything to say. I can't object. Because at that stupid level, we're getting to today, under liberal discourse, obviously. You can't have a liberal order if you don't have a value matrix that sustains that liberal order. You can't have a value matrix when people lack absolutely every virtue, and they don't have their own life, how they lead their own lives. That doesn't mean you have to have a conservative catalogue, ultra-Catholic from beginning to end, of how you have to do things. It's not that. It's simply recognizing, and classic liberals accepted this, that there is a human nature. If not, what's the point in talking about freedom? Why don't we talk about ducks? If we don't distinguish our social nature, our community, why don't we talk about freedom in the world of penguins? It's because we're another species that organizes itself differently, with a different nature. That makes sense to talk about freedom between human beings and not between penguins. I've never seen David Attenborough, who talks about the apocalypse, saying that the few have freedom, not even him. He's the one who has to have an Attenborough doll in his room, so he can bury it every day. So, there's an individualist conception. As I say, it's about the individual, but the individual is understood in society. It's understood that he lives in a community, and he's not an atom. That's the criticism they give us, without having read anything about classic liberalism. Many conservatives, because in classical liberal tradition, it was never understood that the individual was completely isolated from the rest, and that he could decide everything, even if he wanted to be a cat, and identify himself as a cat. It's not possible, I'm sorry. Of course you can. But that's why I'm forced to accept it. Of course you can. And this isn't a joke. There are schools I've been traveling in the United States where children dressed as rabbits arrive because they identify themselves as rabbits, and the classmates have to accept that this is a rabbit. In fact, there was a famous case of a mother in the United States. I don't know if you saw it on Instagram. Many people commented that her son has identified as a cat or something like that, and she wanted to take him to the vet, and the vet didn't take her. And then she complained on Instagram that this was discrimination, because the vet didn't want to take her. That's a level of stupidity. We are liberal, so we can't say anything. No, it's a lie, it's not like that. We can issue judgments of value, aesthetic judgments, obviously also economic value of different things, and we can push a society towards higher levels of virtuosity, that is, of individual responsibility. Because what does being free mean? What are we talking about? That you take care of your life, and that at the same time requires a set of values and habits, without which you can't take care of your life. That's why we educate children in a certain way. And you tell your 8 or 9-year-old daughter that she's not having a drink. You tell her it doesn't matter. even at 18. If she's getting drunk all the time, you're going to worry, right? That's not the way to go. Well, obviously, the law implies equality, and the state actually guarantees freedom and protects it. That's the role of the state. The state doesn't distribute freedom by distributing wealth, which doesn't mean that in classical liberalism, there aren't people who contemplate a space for the role of the state in that sense. But I've never read it as distributing freedom. That's what the liberals and the equalities, and those who follow Marx Hussein and John Rawls, and all those people. So, when you lack freedom, because in the extreme case, you're enslaved, well, this is the concept that begins to be generated from the 19th century onwards. This is an English theory from that time that talks about this, about the positive power, the capacity to do something and enjoy something that's worth it. Freedom is power. If I don't have the power to get to university because I don't have the money, etc., then I'm not free. If I don't have the power to have a certain level of food, then I'm not free. With this logic, what's the limit? Because I could say that I'm not free. Because I can't, I don't know, travel to London in the first class the day I want. I'm not free. I don't have the possibility to develop in that sense, or to fulfill my dream and be a friend of Novak Djokovic. Also, and in fact, there are theorists who propose that kind of state interventions. That is, they speculate about the need for the state to provide what they call capabilities, these basic capabilities, so that people can pursue their own theories, including ideas of how the state can provide you with all the means so that you have a satisfactory sexual life. In other words, the state will provide you with all the means so that you have a satisfactory sexual life. Am I going to talk about the right to orgasm? I don't know. That's a serious discussion. Are conventions right? Yes. In the past, right? No, I imagine. The Beatles ain't talking about those things. But it tells you a little bit about the shortcomings that were in the last convention, I guess. But imagine that level, then, of course, the theorists reach that point. Right? With the fact that freedom is power. They confuse you and end up with sexual gratification, even if the state funds you a statue that represents you so that everyone can see that. That is a way for you to develop psychically, integrally. Theoretically, they accept it as a possibility. Many of them defend the theory of capabilities. I wrote a paper that was published years ago where this example was. So, there you have the concept of positive freedom, rather, the one we're talking about, which basically demands a third-party action. Because obviously, if you tell me, hey, I want to go to college and I don't have the money to do it, so I don't have the same freedom as you, well, the logical conclusion is that the state to give me the same freedom as to give you money so that I can go to college. And so we achieve alchemy, by virtue of which the concept of freedom becomes to mean completely the opposite of what it meant before, in practical terms. Why? Because before it meant to avoid attacking a third party, their property, their daily project. Now, freedom implies attacking the third party, to take away their property, to supposedly give freedom to the other. Right? That's why this concept is so dangerous. What's the limit? How much is redistributed? How much do we have to give? If it's justified on the basis that you're creating social justice and freedom. Social justice is another concept in itself. So, the state ends up providing freedom. Here's a historical example. Roosevelt was basically the founder of the state. in the United States with the New Deal. The New Deal was freedom from want. It was a speech where he said that he wanted to guarantee it by refuting the old freedoms of the founding fathers of the United States. That is freedom from needs. You're not free if you're hungry. You're not free if you don't have a house. You're not free if you don't have health. You're not free if you don't have transportation. You're not free if you don't have pensions. And all of this ended up incorporating human rights in 1948 as human rights, which sounds good. Now it was partly due to pressure from the Soviet orbit, because they had the Constitution, and all of these things were guaranteed to not be fulfilled, like the ones in Latin America, where they are, but they are not fulfilled, or they are not fulfilled very badly. So they pressured to have a moral victory against the West with this, and it should never have been incorporated. How can there be a human right to pensions? You're not disarming. It's not about being disarming. You have to understand the implications. The idea that where there is a need, because a pension is a need, right? A right is born. It is the bomb to destroy any social order. And in fact, that phrase that I want to mention, where a need arises, a right, was by Eva Peron. Eva Peron mentioned it all the time, or she mentioned it in a recurrent way. And there's Argentina, the paradise of social rights. It's the ideal of fascism. It was the one who said that the needs of society come before the needs of the individual. The Nazis were socialists, anti-capitalists basically, statists, right? You'll see what I'm going to say when I release a book I'm going to write about Marx, how the Nazis were also inspired by Marx. So, what's the role of the government? The government has no other role. And this is what worked in the United States. And it ended up creating the United States as the highest power in the world. A government that almost didn't exist. Very limited. This is James Madison, father of the American Constitution. One of them, but the fundamental one. You have the right to enjoy your life, freedom, and you have the right to acquire property. And the government has to assure you that. The government has to assure you to be happy. In fact, in the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Independence talks about all human beings are created equal. It says all men are created equal, and that we are endowed by our Creator with certain rights that are inalienable, such as the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I have the right to pursue happiness, not to be happy. It's different. It's not that I have the right to be happy. So all of you see how I become happy. Because that's where we are. In this type of decadence, we are in the West. And who is the new God? In charge of making us happy? The state. The state will make you happy. And that's not how it's going. So, personal security. Against crime. Against, well, the attack of a foreign nation. That's why the issue of Israel, with its defense. Alright? That's the role of the state. I mean, classical liberalism is not anarchic in the sense that it does not propose the elimination of the state. Classical liberalism, in fact, is the one who explains this, that the way to solve the most urgent problem in the common way, which is violence, is by monopolizing it in the state. Okay, Han, that allows us to devote ourselves to other activities that we are always preparing, training, to kill or be attacked, etc. Right? And at the same time, and this is important, in the forms of the state, and this is what Thomas Jefferson says, there are no rights in society. Society has no rights. To think that society has rights is collectivism. It's what the Nazis create. It's what the fascists create. It's what the communists create. It's what the socialists create. Society has no rights. The individual has rights. In the face of the community. In the face of others. Okay, there may be a common interest. A higher interest that can be, but that there is a right. Just as we claim it from individuals, is not the case. That's why Thomas Jefferson says that the rights of the group cannot be more than the rights of individuals. Totally the opposite of what Hitler says, that the rights of all are superior to the rights of individuals. Do you realize the difference in mentality? One is the totalitarian mentality, that in the end ends up fusing individual rights in this collective thing of general will, said Rousseau, embodied in the state, that in the end is embodied in the party that controls the state, and that supposedly represents the people. And that's where you have the fascist, Nazi, communist systems. That's where all that comes from, in part. Now, the civil society is not that you are a heartless person, because then you will be in charge of the people who suffer. But it turns out that in classical liberalism, there is a tradition of admiration for philanthropy and for the capacity of the human being to connect with those who suffer. And here you have a phrase by Adam Smith that is also usually ignored in debate. No, you are heartless. You don't know who you can be. It's not like that because we human beings tend to organize ourselves to help each other. Okay. You see, in the catastrophes that have happened in Chile, the same with the Teleton. Why did George Jackson want a status? The Teleton? Because George Jackson is fascist. The front of both is all fascist. That's the truth. What difference do they have with the fascists? None. I mean, really. That's how one can get to the point, but in terms of collectivism, they are the same. In terms of anti-capitalism, they are the same. In terms of culture and cancellation, they're the same. In terms of not believing in liberal democracy, the same. And what? It can't be that individuals, just by organizing themselves, solve a problem. It has to be the state. Us, me, Jackson, who controls everything. Nothing outside the state. Nothing against the state. Everything within the state. Mussolini. Did they tell me that something was known about fascism? Mussolini. One or two things were known about fascism. Mussolini. Jackson's manual. Orch's manual. Everyone's manual. They didn't even talk about Petro in Colombia. They are all the same. De Mossa in Argentina. They are all the same. So, well, society. This is a good example. What is this? Is it a game? It's a minute of silence. No, yes, it's a minute of silence. But there they are. But Instructor Y. Herrero, what are they? Players. Right? There are the 28 players. The referees. But it's not a football game. This is an individual group that is standing. And this is before the game. Yes, it's a minute of silence, but it's before the game. Okay. This is a football game. Okay. Look, they're going to pass it to me. This is a football game. Hi, I sent it. It's a game I made. Well, society is the same. Society. This is important to be clear. Society is an event. It's a group of interactions that occur between different individuals, just like a football game. Until they don't start playing, there's no game. If we said, what is that series where time freezes? Years ago, someone could freeze time. Well, if I could do that, and freeze time and everyone is like, 1, 2, 3 mummies. Yes. Well, The Sims can do that. But if I did that, and everyone is frozen, then society is an event. Yes, society is an interaction. It can be free or not free. Be careful, because if it has a totalitarian system, of course, the interaction is not free. It tends to be much less free. But there is something like the society. There is. No, it's virtual, there is all that, but there is. So, society is an event. It's a dynamic process. That society. It doesn't exist, it exists. But in the sense that there is a football game. It's like this auditorium. You're here, you're listening to me. And I can tell you the audience that is listening to me. You are. because there is an interaction. You are sitting, you are there, you are thinking when it's going to end, and then we are in an interaction. But to say that you are listening to something that exists after this ends, and that has a right to something, is a complete fallacy. Because this ends in 10 minutes and it's over. And then we go from an auditorium to a social network, right? The drinkers. So what changes? You look at the dynamic, and then you go home, and probably never. Again, this meeting will be here. Don't start crying. The way things are going, that is very important. To have a present. Yes, we liberals believe that there is society, but society is an event. It's a set of dynamic, spontaneous, unpredictable interactions. There are different ways. And it's not an entity with a right, with an intelligence. It's not like that, right? The state for the rest. I've repeated this 1,000 times, because you don't understand what the state is. People don't. Exactly. This is the classical definition of Max Weber. The monopoly of physical violence, in a certain territory considered legitimate, is an order of domination. The state is an order of domination. That's it. Right? They have the weapons. They have the possibility to determine who lives and who dies, who is free and who is not. That's why you have that this is the state. This is also the state. The state can be liberal, either monarchical, autocratic or not, or democratic, or it can be totalitarian, right? In Germany, there was a Nazi. In the Soviet Union, there was a Nazi, right? But there is also in the Imperial England, in the United States, in Germany today, etc. There is. While there is the monopoly on physical violence, there is the state. The question is, what is the form the state takes? Is it a liberal form that limits power or not? If it doesn't limit power, it doesn't limit the totalitarianism, etc. That's why it's important to have not only constitutions, like the Magna Carta of 1215, which basically limits the monarch's power of the state, but a tradition of freedom, socially rooted. Because it's not enough to have a document that says things. In fact, think about our constitution. Beyond the third world bannerism, that means arguing constitutions for 4 years. And what a responsibility of our inept political class. Beyond that, the Constitution is not respected by the Supreme Court, and what the Constitution says is not respected by the politicians. All that was done by the pension fund was unconstitutional. They cheated to be able to do it through more transitory rules. They don't respect the judges. How many illegal usurpations there are. How many rights of property are totally violated. It's the same. Nobody respects them. I remember in Spain, an exhibition a few years ago that I entered, and it was about the history of Spanish constitutions. And there was a woman, very attractive, with her clothes torn, and as if she had been beaten, and her name was Constitution, and she said, "They made me to be raped." Dramatic. In the end, if you don't have a culture of respect to the rules, it's the same what the law says. Or, to put it another way, it's much less relevant what the law says. Because the problem we have is that the barbarians are not only on the streets, breaking things with the Chilean Union cancelling people, or in the south, with the terrorists or with the narcos. The barbarians today are also in the Congress, in the courts, and above all, in the government. And they have great ideas how to say that Cuban athletes are from tourism. Surely they were buying a Louboutin in Alonso de Cordoba. Did you hear something more stupid? No, if we have to say that this government is superior, every day it's impressive. What is the limit of stupidity that a government can say 2 years before collapse? I don't know. In Chile we are very generous. And here comes the issue of democracy to end. There is a great fallacy in the discussion that generates a bit of urticaria and alertness even with liberals when you talk about these issues. For the classical liberal tradition, democracy is not an end in itself. Freedom is the end in itself, as Lord Acton said at the beginning. Obviously there is a preference for democracy because it tends to better guarantee the protection of freedom and to change the inept kleptocrats who are governing by others so that they don't stay in power forever. But, as John Stuart Mill says, it is a mistake to believe that the people that we call people cannot exert a frightening tyranny of the majority, crushing a minority or an organized minority that goes through a majority and also crushing a majority. The interesting thing is that historically democracy in the classical liberal tradition tends to be understood in the 19th century and before as a possible threat to freedom. Because, of course, when you let the majority decide without limits, usually the results are very bad, and there is a lot of evidence that John Stuart Mill talks about this in several of his writings, as the famous phrase, in democracy says, at the end there are 3 wolves, and you have George Rumpeter, who writes this in his book, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy. It is a political method to reach a certain decision. It is unable to be a faith in itself. And here is the question that I can ask you. Would we be willing to prefer democratic institutions that would lead to persecution and extermination of certain groups for the sole purpose of being democratic, instead of non-democratic institutions that avoided those results? Or is that the majority said that then 5 million people, or Jews or whatever, to concentration camps then, as it is democratic, it is fine? Or no, we have a monarchy, or even an authoritarian regime that is not going to do that. Is it better? Is it better? It is a rhetorical question. Obviously, it is better not to have one, because democracy can be totalitarian. Hayek explained this. Democracy can be totalitarian. So if democracy does not have the liberal component, it is not better than any dictatorship. It can be a dictatorship of the majority in the end. Then, what makes democracy, in addition to a certain mechanical role of replacement of one government for another, which is very valuable? That is why I prefer democracy over another system, obviously. But what makes it that in the last instance? It is a guarantee of individual freedom is only that it is limited in the capacity that the majority have to decide what happens with the rest, or the circumstantial minorities that make it happen for the majority. That's it. And that's liberalism. Because liberalism is a doctrine about the limits of power, and democracy is a doctrine about the transfer of power, how power is transferred, and the rest. Democracy has led to totalitarian regimes. Venezuela, for example. Venezuela is another example. Nicaragua is another example. And here, well, Hayek says that, finally, democracy is not freedom in itself, but also, he was a supporter of democracy in general, because statistically, as a functional instrument, it is better than the alternative. If you don't have the component of liberalism, you don't necessarily see it. This is newer Jason Brennan. We read here the book, and we talk about his book. He wrote a book called Against Democracy. Against democracy. He says that democracy is purely instrumental. All classical liberal tradition says this, and that there is no reason not to think that a better system can be created. Until now, he has a proposal in his book. Until now, we are not bored, but there are non-democratic regimes that respect fundamental rights more than those of supposedly democratic regimes. Singapore, for example. Compare it with many countries in Latin America. Well, Liechtenstein is not a democratic regime. Monaco neither. It is not. But of course, you can say they are almost like that. Well, but there they are. Compare Singapore with countries in Latin America. In Venezuela there is a dictatorship, but even when Chavez was elected, democratically human rights were seen much more there. In Singapore, not to mention how people live in one place and another. I don't see many people wanting to go to live in Venezuela. And well, the challenge for us today with the philosophy of classic liberalism is that governments are growing more and more, and they are getting more and more inclusive, and they are using new technologies, drones, facial recognition, currently the CDC, which are the central bank, digital currency and others to control our lives, and that in Chile has already been proposed. The digital peso is defending it from Gregorio and other people who are totally confused because, although they have good intentions, in the case of them, they are not seeing the risk that it implies for individual freedom and what this instrument can imply in the wrong hands. You always have to think of the configuration of state power as how much damage miserable people could do if they got to have it in their hands. People who are heartless and despicable or evil. And no, how good could I be if I were in their government? This is very important. It is the challenge and the invitation that I have proposed to you so that we continue to defend these principles of freedom, because today they are in their worst moment from the point of view of the threat they face in the last 40 years, and the new technologies are going to pose some scary challenges to protect the freedom of individuals. And if you, who are the new generations, do not actively join to become aware of this, we are going to end up losing freedom. Because, as Reagan said, freedom is always just one generation from extinction. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.